Good morning. My name is James Polli. I'm a faculty member at the University of Maryland. And on behalf of myself, Anna Schwendeman from the University of Michigan, and Sam Rainey from the Food and Drug Administration, welcome to today's webinar, this FDA Center for Research on Complex Generics webinar on excipients and formulation assessments of complex generic products, best practices, and lessons learned. Okay, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of the regulatory framework, scientific concepts, product-specific challenges, and best practices related to development of complex generic drug products that are either required or recommended to have the same formulation as their respective reference listed drugs. Slides and recordings of this webinar will be available in 3 weeks at the CRCG website at complexgenerics.org. And all of you will be emailed when they become available. Just a little bit about the Center for Research on Complex Generics. The goal of the center, which has been in place for about 2.5 years in a collaboration with the FDA, is to increase the access to safe and effective generic drugs through enhanced infrastructure communication, education, and research collaborations across industry, academia, and the FDA. Again, I would encourage you to visit complexgenerics.org, where you can sign up for our listserv. Also, the agenda today is available there, as well as bios. And let me just go to that. So this would be a good time, if you haven't already, to obtain the agenda and bios, okay, at complexgenerics.org. If you go to the events tab, and the first page of the agenda document gives an overview as well as some objectives. And you'll see that shortly Dr. Darby Kozak will be giving a webinar overview. And then the day is divided into 5 sessions. The first one's on regulatory concepts for formulation sameness and assessments. And you'll see that this session, as well as all the sessions, have several speakers, as well as a panel discussion. So please, throughout the day, please use the chat to ask questions. The panels in each session would be greatly appreciative of that, because they do wish to answer your questions. As noted here, and actually throughout the day, the majority of the speakers and panelists are actually from the FDA. So this is a bit of a training effort today. Although we're very grateful that a few industrial speakers will be participating in session 4. Later in the morning, session 2 is on qualitative and quantitative considerations for formulation assessment. Session 3 is on the inactive ingredient database and excipient considerations. Session 4 is on scientific challenges and considerations during formulation development. And session 5 is on best practices for submitting formulation assessment requests and avoiding information requests. In addition to the agenda, also at complexgenerics.org is a detailed speaker biography. So during the course of today, there's lots of speakers and panelists, and we're very appreciative of everyone's contributions. But in an effort to stay on time, we'll kindly ask you to read speaker biographies. Okay, just one note about future CRCG workshops. We do have 6. If you go again to the website under the events tab, you'll see that we have 6 workshops already scheduled for 2023. I won't read them to you since these are available online. I think the one thing that I'll note is that they will be in person as well as online, so they'll be hybrid, and they will be in person at the University of Shady Grove, which is a University of Maryland campus in Rockville, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C. Again, thank you for your participation. Please ask questions via the chat. And again, slides and recordings of this workshop will be available in 3 weeks, and registrants will be emailed when available. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce Darby Kozak, who will provide a webinar overview. Dr. Kozak is a Deputy Division Director for the Division of Therapeutic Performance in FDA's Office of Generic Drugs. Dr. Kozak leads a group of interdisciplinary scientists on the development of new analytical methods and equivalence evaluation methodologies for complex drug substances and parenteral, ophthalmic, otic, and inhalation formulations. Thanks for your overview, Dr. Kozak.
Thank you, Dr. Polli. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's workshop webinar on the excipients and formulation assessment of complex generic products, best practices, and lessons learned. So I do want to start off by thanking Dr. Brian Newman and Dr. Anubhav Kavratna, along with other FDA staff who've helped put together today's exceptional agenda. I also want to thank Dr. Jim Polli and Dr. Anna Schwindeman and all the personnel at the Center for Research on Complex Generics for actually hosting today's event. So as Dr. Polli mentioned, the Center for Research on Complex Generics is a fairly unique collaboration between the FDA's generic drug program, academia, and the generic industry that help us to further the FDA's mission of increasing access to safe and effective generic products by enhancing the research and collaborations and promoting greater engagement with the FDA. An example of this greater engagement is this webinar event today and the other workshops that Dr. Polli mentioned, facilitated through the Center for Research on Complex Generics. As I mentioned, the CRGC is a great resource to both the FDA and generic industry. Over the last year, the CRGC has helped to coordinate a number of impactful workshops and webinars covering a series of critical scientific topics to both the generic industry and to the FDA. These include those workshops that Dr. Polli mentioned on in vitro release testing and in vitro correlation of some of these complex generic ophthalmic, injectable, and implantable products, some modeling approaches to support generic product development, and a recent workshop on the formulation characterization and pharmacokinetics to facilitate generic topical product development. As Dr. Polli also mentioned in his introduction, the CRGC has an exciting agenda of collaborative workshops coming in 2023. And along with him, I highly recommend and encourage everyone today to visit the CRG website to view those upcoming events. Some topics that I saw that were coming up that are very interesting, probably to both you and to us, is a workshop on mitigation strategies for nitrosamine drug substance-related impurities. This has been a fairly hot topic in both the regulatory focus and pharmaceutical industry for the last couple of years. So I'm really looking forward to that workshop. Also, another fairly hot topic, and we've got 2 workshops coming up in 2023, is on workshops focusing on the development and regulatory considerations for drug-device combination products. The current thinking and identification of what the user interface differences are, and as information to support those differences, is of significant importance both to your development of generic drug products, as well as our interest in terms of regulating these increasingly complex drug-device combination products. As Dr. Polli mentioned, recordings of these past events and dates for the upcoming events are all on the CRGC website, and I do recommend that you do visit that site to basically become more familiar with those events coming up. So with respect to today's workshop, as a chemist and a regulatory formulation scientist, I do want to say that today's workshop on excipients and formulation assessment is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure it's going to be promised to be a highly informative day for all you people attending today. It's important to remember that the fundamental properties of a drug product are highly dependent upon its formulation. Regardless of a drug product's complexity, this can be from simple solutions to the more complex liposomal, hydrogel, microspheres, or even drug excipient complexes. That the fundamental starting point that determines the underlying properties of these drug products are their ingredients used and their relative amounts. This is one of the core reasons that you'll see formulation composition, which we colloquially know in the industry as qualitative or quantitative composition, or Q1, Q2 sameness, is often the underlying principle or regulatory recommendation for a starting point in generic drug development. Therefore, as Dr. Polli mentioned, the goal of this webinar is to provide you all with an overview of the regulatory framework, scientific concepts, product-specific challenges, and best practices related to development and regulatory assessment of these generic drug products. We hope that this information will provide you all with a better understanding of the regulatory considerations when developing an appropriate formulation, as well as best practices to present and support a formulation assessment that can reduce the time to generic drug product approval. This includes those considerations and a better understanding of the regulatory feedback and thinking for those products that may be required by regulations to have the same formulation as their reference listed drug. These include products such as parental, ophthalmic, and otic drug products. In addition, those products that may be included recommendations that may be recommended to be formulated the same or no different to be considered appropriate for a specific bioequivalence approach. And there'll be an entire session discussing the two differences between when a product may be required by regulations and those that may be recommended to be formulated the similar for a specific approach. So I do want to highlight that today's event brings together regulatory formulation experts from across Office of Pharmaceutical Quality and the Office of Generic Drugs. I do want to start off by thanking all those people in advance for their work in developing and delivering today's talks. This includes experts in OGD's policy teams that help develop guidance and standards of practice that ensure regulatory consistent approach is taken and communicated with prospective applicants. Experts in our Division of Filing Review who are part of the front line in responding to formulation queries and ensuring that submitted ANDAs are complete for receipt. This includes any formulation aspects within the ANDA submission, as well as experts from our Office of Research and Standards, for whom I'm a division director within, or deputy division director within. Those people in our responsibilities develop product-specific guidance recommendations, as well as help to respond to formulation questions for complex products. We also have experts from the Office of Bioequivalence, who are responsible for the formal review and approval of submitted ANDAs and any waivers or bioequivalence approaches that are dependent on a proposed formulation. And lastly, we've got experts from the Division of Clinical Review and the Office of Policy of Pharmaceutical Quality who help assess maximum daily exposure and maintain our inactive ingredient database, which is a key resource and commitment under both our GDUFA 2 and GDUFA 3. So today's webinar will start off with a session on key regulatory concepts and considerations within formulation development. These regulatory concepts are the basis for ensuring the development of a safe and effective drug product, but are also critical to framing your formulation questions and to better understand the agency's feedback to these questions. Talks in this session will highlight when the agency may be able to respond to a formulation question and why the agency uses the language it does in its response. It's important to note that understanding these little critical nuances within both how to ask a formulation question and how to interpret FDA's response to those formulations can make the difference between submitting multiple unsuccessful control correspondence and resolving the issue of your formulation development in a timelier fashion. In addition, today's webinar will also include sessions on best practices and common issues to consider when submitting a formulation request. Key concepts outlined in these talks will highlight FDA's considerations on the critical information needed to assess a proposed formulation, how to avoid potential information press when submitting those formulation requests, and assessment practices that may help inform the reason for an FDA response or information request. I recommend this session highly because this will tell you a bit more about how and interpreting to make sure the fact that you're providing the FDA with sufficient information to be able to make a substantive response to your formulation request and to prevent any sort of confusion both on the agency's part and on your part about interpreting these sort of results. There also will be a session on the inactive ingredient database and related considerations to support the safe use and levels for an inactive ingredient in a prosgenic formulation. And lastly, a session on the scientific challenges and considerations during formulation development. So before I hand back to Dr. Polli to introduce today's session leads, I want to note that these workshops, surveys, roundtable discussions, and research collaborations that are conducted by the CRGC are not only a great resource to those interested in generic drug development, such as the generic industry who are developing these much needed complex drug products, but also to the FDA's reviewers and researchers who gain a better understanding of the critical challenges and needs faced by the generic industry. For this reason, I'm really looking forward to the discussion in the session on the scientific challenges and considerations during formulation development. But moreover, I really encourage everyone to engage with today's speakers. Although we will not be able to answer everyone's questions within these sessions, please remember that your submitted questions actually help the FDA identify potential gaps and needs that warrant improved communication and research. So with that, I want to thank you all today for joining us, and I look forward to what promises to be a very informative webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kozak. What I'd like to do is introduce 5 people that really contributed greatly to today's event. They are the 5 moderators who will be really guiding us throughout the day. So maybe starting from the bottom, session 5, Vin Feng. So Lieutenant Commander Vin Feng is supervisor in Division of Filing Review, Office of Regulatory Operations, OGD. Dr. Feng is commissioned in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps. His responsibilities include project management and team leader. Again, I would ask you to kindly review the bios that are available on the website for a more full description. Moderating session 4 is Dr. Pamela Gardner-Dorsey. Dr. Dorsey is a senior pharmacologist for the Office of Bioequivalence within the Division of Bioequivalence 3. Pamela performs primary and secondary BE assessments for generic drug products. I also noticed that she is a graduate of the University of Georgia, which many of you may be following, has a very good football team, American football team. So best of luck to, thanks Pamela for all your efforts, and best of luck to the University of Georgia football team, but not too much luck. Moderating session 3 is Michelle Lin. Dr. Lin is a senior physician in the Division of Clinical Review, where she conducts safety assessment of excipients in generic products, comparative analysis reviews, as well as other clinical consults and controlled correspondence. She's also involved in process improvement and reviewer training. Moderating session 2 is Brian Newman. Dr. Newman is a lead pharmacologist and team lead for inhalation and nasal drug products in the Division of Therapeutic Performance 1. Office of Research and Standards in OGD. Dr. Newman's work focuses on developing product-specific guidances and assessing controlled correspondences, citizen petitions, consults, and pre-ANDA meeting requests. And also, leading us off this morning is moderating session 1 is Colleen Lee. She's the acting deputy director for the Division of Legal and Regulatory Support in the Office of Generic Drug Policy, OGD. She advises on generic drug application-specific legal, regulatory, and policy issues. Colleen has drafted regulation and guidance documents and helped develop and implement compliance priorities. Colleen Lee, thanks a lot for putting together and moderating session 1 this morning. Thank you.